Okay, if we can. Yes. Okay, we're going to get this committee meeting started in a few minutes. A few housekeeping agenda items first. We're going to be speaking about an ordinance that is in front of the council relative to the CRB. There's going to be a sign-up sheet going around. If people want to speak, I ask that you sign and that you also keep the comments to the ordinance that we're speaking about so that we can move this along. First and foremost, we're going to have some speakers. We're going to have Kristen Smith, the Corporation Counsel. I'm going to have Renette Relaford from the CRB speak. So if anybody else would like to speak, please sign up and they'll get the thing up here to me so I can see it. I want to, I'm going to ask Kristen to speak first because I was just talking with her and a number of the things that I wanted to say she was going to speak about, so not to detract from what she was going to say. We'll get it going.
Good afternoon, Council, and all our guests here. I'm Kristen Smith, Corporation Counsel for the City. As Councilor Thompson and the Council is aware, the Council, the administration, and the CRB have worked together a great deal this year to try to advance the relationship between those bodies and to improve overall police-community relations. I think we've made really good strides this year. For example, we've reestablished the Police Liaison Committee, which is members of the police department that interact directly with the CRB and provide valuable information and sounding board between the bodies. As part of those efforts, there's been meetings between the bodies, and this piece of legislation, which would amend the ordinance, was discussed at one of those meetings and is an idea that's grown out of all of this. It is just one piece of an overall effort to always, continue to improve the effectiveness of the CRB and improve overall relations. Regardless of whether this passes, the administration, and I know the council, is firmly committed to continuing those conversations, continuing making sure that the CRB continues to hold the important place it does in our city government. As for this particular revision to the ordinance, this is not intended to change the CRB. It's not intended to weaken the CRB or to change its power or authority or its role in overlooking police relations. It's intended to bolster one piece of the ordinance that already exists that gets somewhat overlooked and has been overlooked in litigation. And in the ordinance, it actually says, and I'm going to quote it, "The actions of the board do not preclude action by the judicial system. A finding or decision by the board shall not have any collateral effect on subsequent administrative or judicial proceeding." So that's already in the ordinance. That speaks to the original intent, which was not to provide conclusive judicial opinions on constitutional violations or other legal matters. The purpose of the CRB, I think we can all agree, is to provide an open, transparent avenue for citizens to come forward and air their grievances regarding the police department, and also to provide input to the police department on both disciplinary matters as well as policy matters. And actually, there's been extensive discussions this year about those policy matters. The police department has sat down with the CRB and addressed some of the suggestions they've made with respect to policy, specifically with respect to use of force. The department has implemented some of those suggestions and explained why others may not, be workable. But it has been a very good year, I think, of improvements between the organizations. So I don't want this, I think this amendment to be perceived as a weakening, but more of a clarification. The board would still do everything it does right now. The board would still receive, investigate, and decide complaints of police misconduct. It would still make disciplinary recommendations to the police department. It would still make policy decisions on the police department. nothing would change in terms of the workings of the CRB. This is really more of a matter of what happens down the road when an individual in the community decides to exercise their rights within the judicial system to bring a civil action against the city. It just makes clear that the actual findings of this citizen board, comprised of citizens, wouldn't be given preclusive or judicial effect, because that really just wasn't the intent. So just wanted to make clear that that was the intent behind this, and I'm happy to answer any questions from the council.
Yeah, I have a question for you because I'm listening to what you're saying, okay? And does the CRB seek to take this information to the court? Or does the court get this information themselves?
It is the individual plaintiffs who bring suit against the city who seek to introduce it in the court action.
But it's public information, correct?
Sure.
So all public information is foilable at some point,
Sure.
correct?
We're not making it non-public. It's just that in the actual court proceeding, there's a question of admissibility. Should the fact that the CRB found one way or the other on a particular case be admissible in a court proceeding?
But can you dictate that to the judge? Can you do that?
So there's two pieces of that. Under state law, statutes that deal with admissibility and evidence are generally enforceable on their terms. So we expect that in state court, the state court matter would look at this particular part of the statute and say, okay, so the findings of this body weren't intended to be admitted as evidence, and that would hold. In federal court evidence is dictated by the federal rules of evidence. This provision would bolster the city's arguments in particular cases that the matter would not be admissible.
In state or federal?
That's federal. So state, it would be enforceable as to its terms, in my opinion. Federal court would bolster our argument that it doesn't meet the criteria set forth in the federal rules of evidence.
Can I go?
Other counselors?
Sure. Yeah, all right.
Counselor Carney.
So I'm just going to upset everybody here. Police and folks supporting the CRB, because I got a lot of questions. So I guess my thing that I've never liked how, as long as I've been on the council, how the CRB operates, because I don't think they're truly as independent as they possibly could be. I think New York City probably has a pretty good model of, a separate entity that sort of does their own thing, their own subpoena power. I think as it stands right now, and people can argue with me, the CRB is a branch of the council, and they have subpoena power through us. The issue is folks aren't sworn in when they go and sit down with the CRB, and I think that sort of raises questions of how good is the information that we're getting really. But then, along with that, it becomes police don't participate in these conversations, and I think part of the issue is the fear of I'm just going to plead the fifth because I'm not going to come in and speak because it's going to incriminate me in some way or another, possibly, or may raise certain questions. So I sort of understand and appreciate it, and I guess part of this is the hope is that with something like this, you'd actually get more police participation. Is that? And this is just me spitballing here. I haven't had conversation with anybody about this. I learned about it through someone from the CRB reaching out to me and showing me what in theory would be the stuff coming forward. This is something I'm just starting to look at now.
Sure. I'm glad you brought that up in terms of how this would impact the department's willingness to participate. I think this gets at one of the disincentives. I think this could help improve those relations in that way, because then we're, not looking down the field at how this is going to be used later. So that's one issue. The other thing is I do want to, confirm what you said, which is the hearings, anyone who speaks at CRB hearings are not put under oath. They don't speak under oath.
Yeah,
so that creates an imbalance because you have a police officer who is making the reports under oath, and a citizen who's not bound by that oath.
How often are these hearings, information that's gathered from CRB, like from a hearing with the CRB, how often are those really used in court, and how, and they're, you're nodding your head, so I'm assuming quite frequently, but I guess at the end of the day, it's up for the judge to determine whether they're going to, look, of course a plaintiff against the police department is going to use a CRB hearing where they're found that they're in the right, that they were, that there was police misconduct. So of course they're going to present that as evidence that this independent body found that, the city or the police department was wrong in how they addressed an issue. But I mean, how often are the police officers that were actually a part of that actually there for the meeting and spoke at it? I mean,
So that becomes, so then in litigation, so to answer your first question, how often?
Sorry.
Quite often.
Okay.
Quite often. It's how often is our CRB findings introduced in civil litigation? If it's a police case, and if there has been a CRB case, it will be introduced by the plaintiff. The other question was, shouldn't the court decide? And of course, and the court still would decide, but this just, as I spoke earlier, this goes to the original intended purpose of the body of being advisory and not issuing binding judicial determinations based on the same standard of proof, based on the same protections that are available in a court of law, and it creates jury confusion because a jury says, oh, well, the city itself said this happened, so, kind of gives the benefit of the doubt, kind of tilts the balance from an even level.
So to go back with that and back to my previous question, how often are officers actually speaking? I don't want to say testifying because they're not really testifying because no one's swearing them in. How often are officers actually participating in these hearings that are then used in court? Is it 50% of the time, a quarter of the time, almost never? Like that's really, because I'll be blunt, I think the way we do things is really ineffective with the CRB.
Officers
I think that there are times where it's very, very useful, and it's great when, they do research, they look into things, they question people, bring people forward, and I think a lot of frivolous things are sort of diverted away because the CRB are just citizens that acknowledge this is a little bit ridiculous that you're bringing this forward to us. And then other times they're bringing to light real issues, but I just think the way that we do it, there are other cities and other municipalities that do a better job, and we ought to be and I don't know how I feel about this actual piece of legislation because I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, but I think it at least raises the question of, are we doing the best job possible?
So, are there other counselors who have questions too?
Well, I think we still didn't get an answer to Mr. Carney's last
okay.
question about how
How often do the police
interact
did
with the
the police-
CRB?
the police don't participate.
Right. That's
So
important. to put on.
isn't that a problem in itself?
I do.
Because, I think that if you want to have a fair and balanced process, that both parties should be heard, correct?
But then it brings into question, are we swearing them in so that if they lie under oath, that there is some sort of penalty, as opposed to just, well, he said this and she said that, and then it becomes a bigger issue of who's actually telling the truth, and is there a penalty for lying?
So this goes to, I'm sorry, Counselor.
No, I was just going to say, that sort of goes to the broader picture of what is being discussed in that
I
with,
apologize.
I
I'm
mean,
looking at-
this is about the legislation.
No, and I understand
and
that,
the
but
purpose
this
for the legislation.
From my purview, raises a much larger question of
Right.
how do we conduct
It
business in the city? What is this body's role? What do they do? Are they doing what they do now? Is that good? Is it bad? What's good and bad about it? And can we change it?
First Thursday of every month, they have a meeting right here. You can come right up and watch.
Trust me,
So,
I know.
yeah.
I talk
So-
to my CRB appointee on a regular basis.
I want to address that question, though, about is that a good thing?
Yes.
And is that fair to Counselor President Hudson? That is part of the broader conversations that I referenced at the beginning of my remarks, which is there are conversations going on right now. There's a meeting coming up before the end of the month that recognizes that there can be improvements, and that's one of the issues, for sure.
Because I think it really does a disservice, and I'm not taking, you can do whatever you want to do, but to go before and say, oh, I take the fifth, that's a disservice, because now your voice isn't being heard. So you're shutting the whole process down, and you're leaving these folks to their self to make a determination, because you didn't offer anything into the conversation.
And I appreciate that, and I agree with you. There should be some back and forth in conversation, but it then brings up back to my previous point of the process needs to be cleaned up and a little bit better. It can't just simply be you come in and speak and say your piece and they say their piece and that's it. You have to be sworn in, because if you lie under oath, you should be prosecuted.
And they're sworn in court too, and they take the fifth, so.
No, and I get that. I'm just simply saying that the process needs to be, the bigger picture, it needs to
Yeah.
be talked about.
Okay.
If I could say-
So, question, Counselor.
Yeah, well, I'd just kind of like to make more of a statement just to piggyback off of what, I know the temptation in all these situations is always to make it police versus citizenry, landlord versus tenant, and make it a simple black and white argument. But I think there's a nuanced argument here, so I want to acknowledge that, people have been made that it's one side or the other. I think that there's a conversation to be had here to follow up with Councilor Carney saying, when I have read about this legislation, the fact that those testifying before the CRB are not sworn in is a problem, I think. That's not best practices for anyone. I think that, the fact that you said that some of the expertise is lacking for the CRB. So while this initiative, as part of a broader package you said down the road we're looking at ways to holistically look at CRB, I would feel more comfortable discussing this as we brought those other things in that redefine CRB. And we just saw in Rochester that the vote was 75%, in support of an independent CRB. We have council meetings here, a couple of times a week, and this council chamber is never packed. And it's packed, so we can see by constituency that this is, something that people are wanting,
care about.
yeah, are actually interested and want to care about. So for me, I feel like I'll say this. I feel like it's in the middle of the road, which is never a good place to be. It's kind of like we're kind of here and here, and leaving ourselves open for litigation without having the points that were raised around this conversation. One, people aren't sworn in. Two, we don't know if we have the proper legal expertise to hold these meetings with all the proper protocol that is required of a trial per se. My inclination would be then, let's look at that holistically and let's have people sworn in. Let's give it the resources that need to be given in order to make it meet the criteria that we want to have it met, because at the moment it feels like it's just taking a tooth away of an organization that already doesn't have teeth particularly. From this perspective, and again, I think it's nuanced. I'm not trying to say that because I don't think that's the intent. I think the intent is what you're talking about. We're kind of halfway in between things where we're leaving ourselves open for litigation and we're not doing the proper protocol beforehand. So I think let's do the proper protocol beforehand and let's look at this. I think I'd be more in favor of this if it was part of a larger package to let's look at how we do CRB, and I would feel uncomfortable supporting this without some other, that broader look, that broader perspective that we're talking about in a few months' time, where let's look at CRB as a whole and how do we reevaluate the effectiveness of the whole thing. I don't think we can just support this without that broader look at how do we ensure that we get some results, that people aren't just, speaking to a private audience and then it's given to, it doesn't have any public airing. So I think that, I just wanted to say that. I do think that the goal of this legislation is something that we should be looking at and we should be reviewing it. But for me personally, as my council input, is that we should look at the whole thing.
Do we have any counselors that have questions for the Corporation Council? Yes.
It's probably never good to read in public, but I'm going to read a little bit of these bullets, right? So it says, so this is the language in this proposal. Any reports, determinations, decisions, opinions, or recommendations made or given by the CRB will be considered advisory, evaluative, and pre-decisional, and will be used only by the City Administration and Police Department Command as part of their internal deliberative process, the internal review and examination of the conduct, blah, blah. Okay, next bullet. Reports, determinations, decisions, or opinions, or recommendations of the CRB as a duly constituted civilian advisory body shall not have the authority to issue binding decrees, implement personnel actions, make findings of civil or constitutional culpability, or award damages. Third bullet, any reports, determinations, decisions, opinions, or recommendations made or given by the CRB shall not be admissible in any subsequent civil or criminal proceeding, nor shall they be considered binding or conclusive. All of it seems to me just like a slap to the CRB to say, you don't matter. To the extent anybody ever listens to you, you shouldn't be listened to. And all of that leads to my question of what does the C stand for?
Citizen.
Citizen. It does not stand for cop, okay? It's a citizen platform. And it's there because we don't always feel comfortable. Like, it's nothing against the police, but there are times where police interactions are high stress, and they do have institutional support and all of these things. And as a citizen, it feels uncomfortable to need to go to the police to talk about a problem with the police. So this is really just about a platform for citizens, and I don't think we should pass any kind of changes that all they do is say, look, CRB, don't listen to it. Whoever you are, don't listen to it. You don't matter. They might be lying, all these things. We don't need that. We need a platform that can be respected. And all this does is create this huge debate of, like, what should the CRB, like, should we have a weaker CRB? Should we have a stronger CRB? Should, like, where, I mean, it changes the dialogue in a ridiculous way. So we don't ask a bunch of questions about other things. And I don't think it's against the police or anything else, but this is about citizens. This is about having a platform where they can be heard. And to the extent, the reference to the dollar amounts of settlements with the police, the settlements are for actions by members of the department. It is not a settlement because of the CRB. And lastly, frankly, I think when we sometimes we deserve to be sued. We try to run the city as well as possible, but there are times we make mistakes, and then we do end up paying for that. And while it's unfortunate as a financially challenged city, there's moments where, you know what, we do wrong. And sometimes wrong can be a genuine accident, or it could be a genuine mistake that happen, but we need a platform where citizens can be heard. So that's my only question. Thank you.
Councilor Allen?
Yep.
Okay.
All right, so when you first, from the Corporation Council's perspective, when you first looked over this amendment, did you take into consideration for improvements to recommend to the CRB, or did you only consider this dismantle process? Were there any recommendations that you made to kind of strengthen this portion of the amendment?
As I said in the beginning, those conversations are ongoing.
But up until, so this was when did you guys discuss this? Like the last week or two?
So actually, this grew out of a meeting that happened early in 2019. I want to say February. And this idea was thrown on the table, and there seemed to be support around the table for it. As city business goes, people got busy. They're shaking your head. I thought we brought it up in that meeting, but it hasn't been discussed frequently during the year, but it's something that Steve has brought up and was interested in working on. But as I said before, this is this is not anyone being disinterested in looking at the broader process.
And so what was the motive behind this was strictly to cover the city from financial liability through lawsuits?
I think it's as I said before, to clarify the original intended purpose, which I quoted a section from the statute that needed, in my opinion, to be explained more, so that in subsequent litigation, the language is designed, it probably sounds very lawyerly, right? But that's because the topic that we're dealing with is litigation. So it is, but I don't think it's a change of what the intended purpose was.
Yeah. Because it seems, yeah.
All right, so I don't.
Hold it.
If there's any,
Councilor Carney, Councilor Bay's turn. Yeah. Councilor Bay.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Any other questions for me?
Yeah, and questions. Now, if we're going to have opinions, or we're going to have,
Well,
But it's
we,
not
we have,
changing. That's
listen,
the issue.
we have
That's
opinions,
what it
man,
is.
because we're
And
going to
it's
vote on
not
it.
good enough.
yeah, no,
That's
go ahead.
the issue. We're not
Counsel-
changing anything. We're just clarifying it.
Yes.
It's not good enough. I don't disagree with that, but it's not changing it. It's clarifying what it was established at in 1993 or 4.
So, hello, everybody. If you would, give me a second. Just a question, and then I too, Counselor, have a number of comments. You made reference to it being inadmissible in federal court, potentially. Why?
Why should it be inadmissible?
Why would it not be admissible in federal court?
Can you clarify? Do you mean why is it not
You spoke
currently
spec-
admissible, or why should it? Why do we argue that it should not be admitted?
You made a statement earlier relative to findings by the CRB not being admissible in federal court. Did I hear that wrong?
You mentioned state court,
Sure.
that the ordinance would be enforced, and in federal, that they follow the federal.
Courts have been inconsistent in their decisions in federal court cases. In some instances, they do not admit decisions of CRB and similar bodies. The legal reasoning behind that is long and complicated, and I don't know if I can get into that right now in terms of the various rules and the federal rules of evidence. But in some cases, they have not admitted it for those reasons. In some cases, they have. Courts have been definitely inconsistent. And so one of the things that courts look at is what is the purpose of the underlying determination, what procedural protections underlie that, and there's what I stated earlier is that this ordinance would be something that the city would use in its admissibility or not admissibility argument.
Okay, I appreciate that. But obviously, and I could have heard you wrong, but there's certainly no blanket rule that prevents it from being admissible in federal court. You're essentially saying that it depends on the case. It depends on the judge.
And they have been admitted in federal court.
Okay,
the findings have been admitted in federal court.
All right, then maybe I heard you wrong. Here's just a couple of things I think that has to be considered. I mean, not to be redundant, but Councilor Rudd hit the nail on the head. So, and members of the CRB know that I'm a critic of certain things relative to the CRB. Two things in particular. One, I have concerns about increased liability, right? But the greater concern I've always expressed to the CRB is presenting to would-be injured parties the wrong idea, right? I've always talked to the CRB about being clear about what you can actually do for the citizen versus creating an idea that ultimately discourages people from finding recourse for injury, right? Because that's been our case. I've been here approximately 8 years, and I've had a number of people come to me, and because, they thought the CRB could do one thing, but then learned that it couldn't, they were a little disarmed, if you will, in their effort to find recourse. But I think they've done a great job since in clarifying this much, and I know we've talked about it a lot over the years. But what Councilor Rudd said is true. We wouldn't have a CRB issue had it not been for certain behaviors that might be questionable. The other thing, though, I have to, and this is maybe a question. Council President made a point that we talked about before. Of course, and it's a constitutional right of an accused party to plead the fifth. We know that. Does the same apply to witnesses, though? Could officers who witness an injury plead fifth in a CRB hearing? Or any hearing, at that matter? No.
I don't want to,
But I understand, but I know that they can't. But I just wanted to state that. Here's the thing. Currently, and I made a point to mention that, the PBA, Mr. Piedmont, how you doing? Has a pretty strong contract with the chief of police, that often is not a part of the discussion. And I think there's some things that people may not be aware of, like, for example, the chief has exclusive control over the department. that means technically the mayor can't touch them, we can't touch them. Their contract is with the chief. And I don't know that people know that it's kind of sheltered that way or protected that way. Another thing, though, that has to be considered is that some of the police ability is not relative to local law, but state law. You know, I'll take, for example, residency with the Taylor law, right? The right to live out, or the power, the ability to live outside the city without penalty is based on the Taylor law and based on circumstances in New York City years ago, right? We know we don't cost as much as Manhattan to live, so you would think upstate the rule would be reversed, but unfortunately that blanket passing of that legislation years ago harms us financially and in other ways. I say all that to say, you know, I want to point out, though, that we have to be cautious, and I'm stating this because I stated as much to the administration before and to the chief. I believe in the recent use of force policy, the Supreme Court case that was used was it Graham versus Connor? Yes. And in my opinion, you know, I think, you know, I was a little taken aback by the use of that legislation, because from my perspective, it kind of gives a bit of a free rein on police behavior. And I stated as much to the chief and to the administration. I would like for us to revisit that. And I understand that that law exists, but I think, and I'm going to paraphrase, but where the rights of the citizens are challenged, and I said I'm paraphrasing, or are injured or denied, right? The rights of the citizen can engage in those rights with impunity. That's a paraphrase, but I'm pretty sure most lawyers know what I'm referring to. I don't know where it is, but that means if even government violates my right, I can do it anyway, despite the fact that they call it wrong. That's what that means. You know, so reason why I wanted to mention that, because I don't know that Supreme Court ruling was really about citizens. Last thing I'll say in this respect, that may be the appropriate, and I'm going to apologize earlier to those who will not like this, maybe the appropriate approach. And what I'm talking about is fairness. Let me be clear. I grew up on the South Side. There's, you know, and there's people who violate rules. We see them every day if we live anywhere in the city. There's some people who violate rules that require police attention. Let's be clear. There are some people, fewer in number, who are sometimes a little aggressive, even with the police. I'm not going to sit here and act like that doesn't happen, because I've attempted to calm people down sometimes before. It's not a whole lot of people, you know, but so we know that happens. The unfortunate thing, though, is oftentimes innocent people get caught up in that blur, and they take the unintended beating. And even for the person who may be, you know, alleged to be guilty of a crime, they take what is arguably an unconstitutional bruising when their rights afford them, you know, a right to a fair trial and the like. I won't comment on my previous position some years ago about use of force. What I will say in closing, Mr. Chairman, is that maybe the public need to consider a state referendum. You know, the thing is, when you want rules, we can attempt to do so much, but the state rule is always going to become the back door, if you will, to issues we think should be different here, but we don't have the power to change locally. But in the same way that you seek referendum with the local government, we can seek referendum on the state level for rules that we do not agree with. And so if there are rules that we don't agree with, I think a lot of consideration needs to be given to that kind of effort, and I'm pretty sure there's a lot of people across the state who would agree. Thanks.
Thank you. One, Councilor Green, and then a question. Yes.
Thanks. Okay, so this conversation about the relationship between police and the community is not something that's unique to Syracuse. It's a conversation communities around the country are having. So my question is, in communities that have a particularly effective Citizens Review Board, how does this proposal compare to the kind of best practices around the country?
I don't have an answer for you for that off the top of my head, but I can get back to you.
Okay.
I know that in other, I mean, there's, well, I'll stop there.
I have one more quick, can I just,
Sure.
one more quickie? So, Kristen, when you said you had discussions, okay, I just want to kind of just throw this out here. When you're having discussions, please, please understand there is a group of 4. The chair is not the end all for everything, okay? He has 3 other people working under him, which under this, for police committee, is Joe Driscoll, Counselor Allen, and Counselor Rudd. So if you need to get information deciphered, I would urge you to reach out to everybody that sits on public safety.
Okay.
And she is, as the corporation counsel would probably say, that she has met with me, and I have passed down this information to others. Well, that's a whole nother discussion. So,
Steve, can I have one more? You going?
no, I'm gonna move along. So
Just had one more, if that's all right. For
we're
Kristen.
gonna move along and have.
Is that
have the-
cool? I just had one more for Kristen. Sorry. So there's two questions. There's 2 things to consider here. There's one that's is this a good practice? This is a good idea. But the other question is kind of to the Syracuse.com article referenced that it's in the judge's discretion, even if the city codifies this, that if a judge should call for it. So there's also kind of, in my mind, I'm still not quite clear on. So like, for example, when we did interior rental registry, that doesn't mean that we have the carte blanche right to walk into someone's house. We have to, there's still a legal process we have to. Is this similar in that respect, where basically we would be codifying something, but a judge, ultimately it comes to a judge's discretion whether they use it or not? I guess I'm curious as to what this codifies, because ultimately isn't it a judge's decision whether they want to use the CRB stuff, regardless of what we rule locally? I'm just that's.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, we've talked a bit about federal court. Yeah, I mean, the judge makes the rule on admissibility following the federal rules of evidence. The language employed in the amendment would broaden the discussion of sort of the status and purpose of the body that would contribute to the arguments that we would make when we were seeking to, if we thought it was not appropriate to be admissible, it would help those arguments. In state court.
So this would just strengthen the argument that a judge would have to reach harder to access the information.
Yes.
The city would have more grounds to say.
Yes.
So the judge could still ultimately get access to it, but it would be codifying it that unless they went above and beyond, then is that kind of my understanding of it?
Pretty much.
That's kind of like a layman's
Sure.
kind of
Yes.
explanation of it. Okay, thanks.
So,
I just wanted to
so
clarify.
now that's at federal, at the state
Yeah, in
level.
state
you
court,
said.
What about the state
you know,
level? What's the distinction there?
You know, our research has shown that in state court, statutes that speak to the admissibility of evidence are generally enforced on their terms. So this would have more impact in state court.
I just want to say this in fairness, and I swear I'm going to be quiet after this, Mr. Councilor Thompson. All of us have public officer responsibility. I'm talking about elected persons in positions of power in government, police departments, so on and so forth. We make a wrong statement in here, it's a headline. We get dragged across the coals. We got to watch our constituents talk about us like dogs. To be quite frank, I believe most of those people don't even live in the city, but I just want to throw that out there. We can't breathe wrong without being accused of some wrongdoing. There is no, what do you call that? There's no free pass for questionable behavior for anybody. And so for the many people who sometimes feel like, at times persons on the council may make anti-police statements, it's not true. I don't want to sound cliche. I know a lot of good officers, right? That's not true. But me personally, I don't seek to gain at the expense of other people. And I most certainly do my best to avoid abusing my position. And sometimes, while it may not be purposeful on the part of some people, but I think sometimes, some things can be emboldening, and in some situations, as Councilor Carney mentioned earlier or implied earlier, could be, high tense situations. I'm certainly not an officer. I don't know what they deal with every single day. But we still have the responsibility to make a choice. And your choice is your absolute power. Nobody takes that from you. And in those moments, you can make right choices with all due respect to not cause sometimes irreparable harm to people. You know, so if we can't breathe wrong without getting bad headlines and storylines, nobody should be able to. That's just talking about fairness.
Okay, we're going to move this along. Renette, we're going to give her an opportunity to discuss this, if we could keep it to discuss the legislation, how you think this impacts or how you feel this is going to impact the CRB.
Raynette Relaford, Administrator for the Citizens Review Board for the City of Syracuse. First off, I would like to applaud the Common Council members who have made the time today to sit on this public meeting and also to ask very poignant questions that needed to be asked of our Corporation Counsel here, Kristen Smith. I echo many of your concerns, and I also want to point out that many of those same concerns are our concerns with the language that is proposed in this amendment. Most of the parts about it being advisory, you know, we oftentimes fight with the public in terms of stating and showing what the worth is for them to come to the Citizens Review Board. Their fear of retaliation by the officers is real. I mean, extremely real. You don't know how many times that I have to tell a person when they're in my office making a complaint about the fact that if they feel like now they're under a microscope or they're being watched more, that they should call me and I'll make phone calls. How many times do I have to tell that to them for them to even finish a complaint form? So without having the CRB office for them to come in and expect them to just come to the police department to file a complaint is really ridiculous. And we talked about what does the C stand for and the CRB. It stands for the citizens. The citizens voted the Common Council members, and I agree we don't get to vote in the officers that police the street. But we should be able to voice the concerns that we have with regard to our interaction. The CRB works for the citizens. We were established with that in mind back in 1993, revamped again in 2011 to strengthen that point. We've been down this road before as to the officers not participating in 1993, not participating currently, and quite frankly, this new amendment isn't going to help them participate either. When you mention the fact that we've had discussions, you're correct, we've had discussions. And this was really a gut punch, as far as I'm concerned, to those discussions and us trying to continue to come to the table with the police department to work with them in a sense to understand what their concerns were with regard to the CRB. But for this to kind of happen on a Thursday right before our CRB meeting, and then me asking whether or not the common counselor that was presenting it was going to present it to the CRB, and them advising they're not available, that was a gut punch. A real gut punch. And that really frustrated us to no end as we have been working for the last 2 years trying to rebuild the relationship and sit at the table to understand, as you want to say, Kristen Smith, that we don't understand police policies and procedures. We've sat at the table to try to do that. But when has the police department sat at the table before the citizens at a hearing, answered questions without pleading the fifth? You couldn't answer that, could you? So therefore, any opportunity that you sit up here and take to try to limit what we have, or when you misunderstand what was written in the original legislation, it's a gut punch, and that doesn't feel good. And I'm not going to stand for, and I don't believe the community is going to stand for, as you can see in this room, for you to take any more gut punches at this community that the police department already has.
Well,
So, you mentioned to the fact that I'm going to get back to the amendment.
No, would you, address your
Okay, I'm going
comments
to.
here, please.
So you mentioned portions of the police department not, the CRB not swearing officers in. Police departments are supposed to be sworn to their statements, correct? But they lie in those, correct? We've seen that already. They lie in court proceedings. We've seen that questionable already. So what would that prevent them from lying to us? There's no prevention there. So you want to hold the citizens to a real high standard with regard to them telling the truth, but we want to hold the officers to that same standard, but you don't give us the opportunity because I don't get to ask them questions and things of that nature. So this amendment, let's go back to that part.
Please.
Okay. So let's go back to that amendment in which you state that it wasn't the intent of the CRB. The intent of the CRB was for the CRB to be strong. It was for the CRB to be considered as a body that was going to give the citizen the opportunity to get some sort of redress. That's what the Citizens Review Board was about. This amendment is another gut punch, again, for not stating that that is the central purpose of this. And this was not discussed. This was not, given the proper opportunity. And as we can see, the public demands that we have more opportunities to discuss different factors related to the CRB, but not this.
Would you suggest that we're not having a discussion now?
I would suggest that there needs to be multiple discussions with multiple parties around the table, which President Hudson articulated. With regard to all parties.
And this, you get, I'm the chair here. You're gonna follow the procedure. Renette, you're fine. Okay, there'll be time to ask questions when she's through.
This is
what
we're supposed to do. I'm tired of us having behind the scenes conversations. This is what we're supposed to be doing.
Yes, correct. So, Renette, could you please continue? Go ahead.
I would urge us to continue to focus on the fact that the Citizens Review Board is for the citizens, and that as public officials, we need to give the citizens as much voice as possible. This gut punch that you decided to do at this point in time does not do that, and it doesn't weigh in all the options that are available to strengthen the CRB, to add more directives for all parties. So therefore, I can't support this amendment. And again, I feel that it's necessary for us to have more meetings just like this. And one discussion today, right before a vote on this coming Monday, is not sufficient discussion.
Sharon? Peter, could you hold, please? We have Sharon Owens that's going to speak, Deputy Mayor.
Sharon Owens, Deputy Mayor of the City of Syracuse. I echo what a couple councilors have said. I think that this amendment needs to be part of a larger, comprehensive discussion about the operations, the administration of the CRB. We have, and I don't know where Renette went, we have been having multiple conversations over 2 years with Renette, who, and this is not to get any claps, is doing a fine job. With Renette, with the members of the board, with the chief who meets with her on a monthly basis, with a committee of both the CRB and the City of Syracuse Police Department to work through some of the issues, including officers participating in the process. We have gotten a long way over 2 years. And I think that this amendment is preempting the progress that we made. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Peter.
I'll be very quick because I want to hear from citizens. There is so much wrong with this proposal that I didn't even know where to start. But I'm going to mention 3 things very quickly. The first one is that the stated reason for it to clarify whether CRB findings can be used, it probably doesn't even do that. But if it did, I point you to Councilor Rudd's remarks about the continual characterization of the CRB as an advisory body with no power to do anything. And that's almost a quote from the language in there. This is an attempt to insert that language into the statute so people can point to it and say, see, it says right here, the CRB has no power. But what I would like to talk about for a minute is the process. It took 30 years to get the law in place, of citizen action, of multiple organizations pushing the council, and finally in '93 getting the ordinance passed. 20 years later, Pam Hunter put together a committee with representation from the community and from multiple organizations, and they spent 6 months reviewing the ordinance and made some revisions, which passed in 2012. Last Wednesday, 4 business days ago, we got this thrown on our desk with a notice that it would go directly to the Common Council. We said no. It must go to a public hearing. There must be reason to discuss it. We have not heard from the Corporation Council for a year. Since one of those meetings when she brought up, well, we've got to clarify that language and it can't be used in other places. We've not heard a word till we got this. So thank you all for coming today, and we'd like to hear from you.
Okay, folks, if we can, if anybody would like to speak, up now, hold it.
Are we? No, we're doing?
No. No. Yeah.
We can have a public hearing.
Yeah, there is. This
isn't a
No,
public
no, there's
hearing.
not
That's
a
the
public
point.
hearing,
This
it's a
is
committee
Do
meeting.
you want
It
to?
should be a public hearing.
All right, so is there a sign-up sheet, or do we get to ask
There
questions?
is, here. Hold on, hold
I was
one
asking a
second,
question. Can I hear his answer?
please. Hold 1 second, please.
Is there a sign-up sheet, sir?
There is a sign-in sheet.
Okay.
It's
There
a
is
committee
a,
meeting, though. It's not a public hearing.
yeah, this is a committee.
Well, since we're here, can we say something?
Well, here's the thing. Here's the thing. So everybody understand, it should have been made clear that this was a committee meeting. Public hearings have to be advertised a certain way. That's when you have a sign-up sheet to speak. You know, so
Is the answer yes or no? I just want to know.
No.
the short answer is no.
Okay, so
But that's what I'm explaining. So I want you, but don't get defensive. I want you to hear.
I'm not getting defensive.
Okay, so here-
I don't need a long explanation. I just need a yes or no. That's
It's
it.
a no. So you got that answer.
Okay, so anyways.
No,
I'm
there's
gonna
no
make a
anyways. You
statement.
can't do that. You can't do that.
First things first, this
You can't do
proposition
that.
is racist.
You can't do that.
It upholds unbalanced power
See,
and
even for
further
the-
contributes
even
to the
for-
racial
even
and
for the
social
many of us who
injustices
support-
that resent the city of Syracuse that currently face. I'm gonna keep
We
speaking.
gotta
Thank
hold
you.
some procedure here.
So, like I said, if you don't want this to be part of your legacy, you should consider. I mean, I don't need a mic, so y'all can shut it off. So again, ma'am, I'm not respecting. No, they're disrespecting our community by proposing this. So I'm gonna speak my part. Thank you. Thank you. So, like I said, this proposition is racist, and it upholds unbalanced power. And if you don't want it to be a part of your legacy, I will encourage people on the council not to pass it. Secondly, it's real interesting how y'all don't put this same amount of energy in proposing that racist, violent, and abusive cops get fired, because then we wouldn't have to have people going to the CRB because we would have less violent people on the force. Interesting.
I wish you would allow us to
Excuse me.
I wish you would
I'm not
allow us
done.
to complete our committee meeting.
You could reduce lawsuits by firing racist and violent cops. Speaking of the CRB's power,
We're not
in 2017,
in charge of police
the
firing
CRB,
and hiring.
excuse me,
That's not our job.
I'm talking.
No, if you're saying there's no rules, then there's no
if the
rules.